President,
The Senator from Maryland.
I ask unanimous consent that I be able to finish my remarks prior to the scheduled vote at 11:30.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the end of this month, the United States Supreme Court is slated to hear oral arguments in the case of West Virginia versus EPA, in which the justices will consider the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. The stakes could not be higher. This case will have lasting impact in Maryland, the nation, and the planet. As we follow the science and work to mitigate the damaging impacts of climate change, it is imperative that the court respect EPA's authority, which Congress granted to regulate greenhouse gas emissions to protect public health and the environment. I would like to take a moment to consider where we are and how we got here. At issue in the case is the question of whether EPA acted outside its statutory authority when it promulgated in 2015 the Clean Power Plan, the CPP, which established guidelines for states to limit carbon dioxide emissions from power plants. The Trump administration repealed the CPP and issued in its place the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which eliminated or deferred the guidelines. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit vacated the Affordable Clean Energy Rule as arbitrary and capricious. One of the challengers, North American Coal Corporation, challenged how broad the EPA's authority is to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Notably, the Clean Power Plan was never implemented. The Clean Power Plan was never implemented. Yet several of the parties challenged the plan are asking the Supreme Court to issue a decision far beyond whether the CPP constitutes a reasonable interpretation of Section 111D of the Clean Air Act. The challengers have put forth interpretations of two legal doctrines, the non-delegation and major questions doctrines, that could, if adopted, strip EPA of its authority to regulate greenhouse gases entirely. The Supreme Court has spoken on the Clean Air Act. In 2007, in Massachusetts versus EPA, the Supreme Court decision ruled that EPA has the authority to regulate heat-trapping gases in vehicle emissions. The majority found that the agency could not sidestep its authority to regulate greenhouse gases that contribute to global climate change unless it could prove a scientific basis for its refusal. There is none. The same year, the Environmental Defense versus Duke Energy, the court ruled unanimously with regards to the EPA's authority to regulate factories and power plants that add capacity or make renovations that increase emissions of air pollutants. In the current case of West Virginia versus EPA, I joined Chairman Carper's amicus brief with nearly 200 members of Congress. The brief illustrates EPA's authority under the Clean Air Act to protect the public from harmful pollution, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and address the climate crisis. It also rejects arguments made by the petitioners challenging the EPA's authority to address carbon pollution. It is among a notable number of briefs filed in this case, many citing my home state of Maryland. In their briefs in support of the respondents, climate scientists observed that heavy rain and snowstorms across most of the United States have increased in both intensity and frequency since 2001. The Northeast region also faces flooding, particularly in the historic districts of cities like Annapolis, Maryland, home to the U.S. Naval Academy, and Newport, Rhode Island, as well as portions of Washington, D.C. near the tidal basin. For example, human-caused climate change made the exceptionally heavy precipitation and flooding events that occurred in 2018 in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Washington, D.C., up to 2.3 times more likely. The Washington Post reported that more than 40% of Americans live in counties hit by climate-related disasters in 2021, including 3 in Maryland, St. Mary's County and Culver County in southern Maryland, and Dorchester County along Maryland's eastern shore. According to FEMA data, each suffered declared disasters spawned by hurricanes. Because of the vulnerability in my home state, I took direct action in 2019. I was proud to lead an effort with over 20 of my colleagues in a joint resolution providing for the congressional disapproval of the Trump administration's repeal of the Clean Power Plan. Maryland is at risk. not only to extreme weather events, but also to slow onset climate impacts that are equally damaging. The National Park Conservation Association, in its brief, remarks on Maryland's cultural history. The Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historical Park is located in Maryland. The approximate elevation of the park is a mere 3 feet above sea level and is surrounded by the inlets of the Chesapeake Bay. Viewed another way, 3 feet is half the depth of a quarter of the bay. As water levels continue to rise, this National Historical Park may be permanently lost. The National Park Conservation Association brief discusses the obligations Congress conferred on EPA to protect public lands and their resources. On February 15th, NOAA announced that the Interagency Sea Level Rise Technical Report, which provides the most up-to-date sea level rise scenarios available for all U.S. states and territories. The report projects sea level along the coastline will rise an additional 10 to 12 inches by 2050, with specific amounts varying regionally, mainly due to land height changes. The effort is a product of the Interagency Sea Level and Coastal Flood Hazardous and Tool Task Force, comprised of NOAA, NASA, EPA, USGS, Department of Defense, FEMA, and the U.S. Corps of Engineers, as well as several academic institutions. The report leverages methods and insights from both the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, 6th Assessment Report, and supporting research from the U.S. Department of Defense Regional Sea Level Database. The report tells us that the United States is expected to experience as much sea level rise by the year 2050 as it witnessed in the previous 100 years, and it must serve as a wake-up call. Maryland's urban and suburban centers, in addition to our rural communities and coast, are in danger. The National League of Cities and the U.S. Conference of Mayors, in their brief, state that Baltimore, Maryland, as well as other major cities, including Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and Boston, have all experienced significant increases in exposure to wildfire smoke that prevailing winds carry across the country. State and local governments are taking action. In their brief, the National League of Cities and the U.S. Conference of Mayors cite that in 2013, Baltimore developed comprehensive responses touching infrastructure, building codes, natural coastal barriers, and public services to threats from rising sea level, heat waves, and storms. In central Maryland, Annapolis developed the first in its kind, the Nation Cultural Resources Hazardous Mitigation Plan in 2018 to mitigate climate impacts on important cultural and historical landmarks. And the Eastern Shore Climate Adaptation Partnership has brought together local governments from across the Eastern Shore to prepare for climate impacts. Private companies, too, are among subnational actors that are all in on climate. Maryland's McCormick & Company has set a new, more ambitious goal for reducing greenhouse gas emissions 42% by 2030, after achieving its prior target of 20% by 2025, 4 years earlier than expected. The spice manufacturer and a Fortune 500 company has also announced a new commitment to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, in line with the enhanced U.S. national determined contributions Secretary Kerry delivered ahead of the COP26 meeting that occurred last year. But the company cannot mitigate climate change alone. The federal government must support it. The Clean Air Act is an essential tool by which we do so. Through the Build Back Better agenda and elsewhere, Congress is taking an all-in on the above strategies to combat climate change, complemented by the Biden administration's whole-of-government approach. I am proud that the draft Senate Environment and Public Works Committee title to fulfill reconciliation instructions includes funding legislation to make federal buildings greener, but more is needed. The legislation also includes funding for water utilities to enhance their resilience to natural hazards, as authorized by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. The Supreme Court must tread carefully in curtailing any specific tool, including the Clean Air Act, and must not intercede where legislative efforts to curb EPA's authority have failed. Conversely, we must continue to pursue as many avenues as possible to deal with the climate crisis. With that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.